afternoon. Welcome everyone. I'm Stephanie Fisher with the Education Department. Actually, I think it's just our team on here right now, but so everybody knows me. At Michigan Bankers Association, we are delighted to welcome you to our webinar this afternoon, Standing for Equality, Connecting with LGBTQ and Consumers in your banking world. Just a quick couple of housekeeping items. We are recording, so please look out for the recording link from me and share it with your teammates as well. If you have any questions for our presenter, we have a small group today. You can certainly ask them verbally, or you can use the chat. We'll monitor that as well. Before I introduce our speaker today, though, I would like to introduce Rand Painter, the president and CEO of Michigan Bankers Association, and congratulate him. Rand was just recently recognized as one of the 2021 Crain's Detroit Business Notable LGBTQ in Business. So we're very honored to work for Rand and congratulate him on his acknowledgement and award for that. So welcome, Rand.
Thanks, Stephanie, and thanks everyone for being on our call today. Really appreciate your interest and engagement in learning more about serving the LGBTQ community and affirming them as customers and as prospects for your organizations. It does make a difference when you, everyone wants to feel welcome, no matter who you are. And so when I was in a session earlier today, and when everyone is treated with kindness and hospitality, whether you are gay, Black, male, female, it's just a more welcoming environment. So kudos to you for being a part of this today. We're thrilled to have Jim Perry with us today. His firm has been a great partner for a number of our seminars throughout the years at the MBA. So I'll turn it back to Stephanie to welcome him. And I am not going to be on video because I'm mobile today. So I'm going to place the iPad in a safe spot and turn the video and sound off, and look forward to the audio, not the sound, because I do want to hear. I'll correct myself there. But Rose, it's good to see you down there in my right corner at Union Bank. Just saw Court earlier today, and thanks for being a part. Stephanie, back to you.
Thanks, Rand. I'd like to welcome Jim Perry today. He is a senior strategist at Market Insights. They are a consulting firm with expertise in market assessments, delivery optimization, strategic planning, branding, marketing, and culture. Jim has consulted with clients throughout the US since 2005. The majority of his work is concentrated on strategy, development, culture, and leadership, and he has been included on, is it Analytical's list of top 100? Okay, top 100 fintech influencers, and has shared his insights at state, regional, national, and international conferences. Thousands of community banks and credit unions follow his daily Twitter feed for industry trends and the latest news on mergers, fintech marketing, and much more. Jim is a consultant, trainer, and public speaker, known for making complex concepts easy to understand and simple to apply. And we just learned today, Jim is Kalamazoo based, so a fellow Michigander. Welcome, Jim.
Thank you, Stephanie. And again, congratulations, Rand. That's really great news. And yes, in fact, I'm broadcasting today from my home in Kalamazoo. So even though our firm is based out of Seattle now, it's so much nicer for me to be able to come to you and share with local folks. I'm especially excited to see Union Bank represented, because I'm actually referencing part of what you're doing in another speech I'm giving next week, because I'm really excited to see what you're doing incorporating video into your apps and into your mobile applications. So anyway, it's always exciting to spend time with Michigan bankers. And I'm especially excited to be able to share with you today my thoughts and hopefully some suggestions that you can think about when you deal with the issue of reaching out to the LGBTQ community. Let me see if I can share my screen real quick. There we go, making sure all of technology works first, which is always important. One of the things we're discovering is that it doesn't really matter the size of your bank. It's becoming important for every institution to focus on the issue of not only building a diverse and equitable and inclusive workplace, but also reaching out more increasingly to meet the needs of the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer community. And of course, for the purpose of this presentation, I'll be using the acronym LGBTQ throughout this entire presentation. In early March, the FDIC had released their strategic plan for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And their chair, Jelena McWilliams, emphasized how important it was not only to foster a safe and open national banking system, but was really emphasizing how important it was. As a matter of fact, I'll just simply quote her. She said, "When we help remove obstacles in the banking system that stand in the way of people achieving their very best, we strengthen society as a whole." So she's saying when we as bankers come together and work to make sure that not only our system, our workplace, but our system overall is safe, fair, and inclusive, we are going to help strengthen society as a whole. Now, her statement really caused me to reflect quite a bit on how this past year has put the spotlight on some of our country's greatest weaknesses, actually, even pointing out some of our inequities as well as our divisions. But it also prompted me to think about how our nation's banking system and our community-based institutions in particular have an opportunity to think and work in new ways in order to bring about change. So a little later in the presentation, I'm going to share 4 steps with you that I believe you should consider when marketing to LGBTQ audiences. And I think it'll also provide some insights for you in terms of the needs of your LGBTQ employees. But I want to start by reminding you first that connecting with any consumer these days is no longer just about persuading or prompting or promotion. At a very fundamental level, our work as bankers, it's a process of understanding your customer, really helping them and building and maintaining relationships. Some banks have already discovered that connecting with the LGBTQ community is no different. It's about understanding them. It's about helping them. And it's about building and maintaining relationships. Now, earlier this year, back in June, the LGBTQ community marked the anniversary of the 1969 riots that occurred at the Stonewall Inn, based in Greenwich Village neighborhood of New York City. That incident is pretty much widely known as that constituting the most important event leading to the modern fight for LGBTQ rights in the United States. 52 years later, that's a long time and a lot has changed. Just this past June and again next month in October, which is LGBTQ History Month, the community will come together, and it doesn't matter. Institutions large and small, urban, suburban, rural, they're going to find ways as we emerge from this global pandemic to celebrate the progress that's been made towards LGBTQ equality. Now, in the past 20 years, especially, if you think about it, it wasn't too many years ago that LGBTQ rights were advanced pretty dramatically, particularly with marriage equality and workplace discriminations decided favorably by the Supreme Court. Much of corporate America, including a lot of financial institutions, really played an important role in making some of that happen by shaping public opinion and boosting LGBTQ diversity in their own workplaces. While there's a lot of work yet to be done, and especially here in Michigan, those advancements have really created greater visibility and legal protections for LGBTQ Americans. Currently, more than 400 companies have signed on to support LGBTQ civil rights that's moving through Congress right now. While that legislation is running into some headwind, it is necessary legislation because half of the US LGBTQ plus population lives in a state that actually doesn't prohibit employment discrimination. Now, there was a 2020 study by Boston Consulting Group that found 40% of LGBTQ plus employees are not out at work, even though they wish they could be. And 36% of employees who are out or have maybe lied or covered up parts of their identities at work in the past year. But the statistic that was most troubling that I wanted to share with you is that 75% of employees reported experiencing at least one negative interaction related to their LGBTQ identity at work in the past year. And 41% of those had actually experienced that kind of negative interaction more than 10 times. That's why there's so much cause for change. Now, despite those kind of challenges and despite those kind of statistics, you know, attitudes really have changed. Just this year, the Lego Group presented a brand new set called Everyone is Awesome. And it includes pieces and figures that display the colors of the diversity flag. Now, when they announced that new set, of course, you'd imagine they might have gotten a little pushback from some corners of our culture. But at the same time, they put out a really important message, and I want to read it to you. It said, "This sends a signal to everyone that this is what we stand for, that the Lego Group, we want to embrace everyone because creativity is for everyone." Now, as I say, while that support garnered a little pushback, they knew that by supporting LGBTQ individuals is really pretty stable right now. Increasingly, more and more individuals are supporting and expressing support for the LGBTQ community. Right here in Michigan, there are many companies that have earned high marks for their movement towards equality. Herman Miller, Meyer, Steelcase, Stryker, Whirlpool, certainly Kellogg, they all got 100 score on the Human Rights Campaign's Equality Index. Dixon Wright, Dow Chemical, Dykema Gossett, and Kelly Services, right here in Michigan, were also part of that particular list. Even Consumers Energy and DTE Energy made that important list. More and more companies are really moving forward and helping make a lot of progress towards equality. But again, the point or the statistic that I thought was specifically important to comment on today is that a poll that was just conducted found that 76% of Americans favor laws that would protect LGBTQ individuals from discrimination. Of course, while there are banks taking a very active stand for equality, there are still many forms of financial discrimination against LGBTQ plus consumers. Right now, there are only 15 states where credit non-discrimination law covers sexual orientation and gender identity. In Michigan, there are no explicit prohibitions for discrimination in credit based on sexual orientation or gender identity. In fact, researchers from Iowa State University found that same-sex couples were 73% more likely than heterosexual couples to be turned down for a mortgage. Now, a few years ago, many in our industry were actually pretty surprised when a banking charter was approved by the state of Michigan for the creation of Superbia Credit Union, an LGBTQ plus focused financial institution. Now, one of their organizers, when asked about it, he said, "Look, I can walk into a bank or credit union and apply for a loan or a credit card or savings account, and frankly, it's no problem. But if I walk into the same institution with my husband, we could come across very different responses and welcomes." That's all. whoops, I think I lost my signal. There we go. Similar stories are what prompted the creation of a new company called Daylight. It's the first digital banking platform in the US here that's specifically designed for the LGBTQ community. And the millennial founders of Daylight are solving problems that they face themselves as LGBTQ individuals in everyday banking and finances. So I think, with all of this going on, despite those two focused institutions, some of the nation's biggest banks, they're the ones that have taken significant steps to outreach to the LGBTQ community. Pretty much all major North American banks are demonstrating some form of LGBTQ inclusive marketing. Now, given the size of their institutions, their markets, and of course their advertising budgets, it's probably not surprising to see that the scope of their outreach can be pretty dramatic, like Capital One outfitting all of their ATMs with rainbow neon. Yeah, that's pretty impressive. But there are some other examples that I'm going to explore because smaller community-based institutions can learn from these top financial brands. But when I was in Chicago this past summer, I noticed that they had gotten their branch all outfitted in rainbow colors and really promoting their Pride messages back during Pride Month. And that's important, but there are so many ways that banks can support the LGBTQ plus community. Now, one of the things that they decided to do about 2 years ago now was they were going to be one of the first banks in the country to introduce their true name MasterCard or debit card, which is a credit card or debit card that would allow a transgender or non-binary individual actually display the name that they were always meant to have on their credit card. They used targeted messaging through YouTube, through Facebook, through other digital channels just to share that important announcement. And once again, they're a fairly large regional bank. But I've always wondered, why are there so few community-based institutions making an effort to reach what is such a significant portion of the population? Now, I get it. Many prefer to stay neutral when it comes to matters involving politics or religion or sexual orientation or gender. But by refusing to acknowledge this portion of the community, they're ignoring the fact that some of their customers are LGBTQ. And by ignoring that, they're less likely to be able to attract those customers. And they even risk alienating the ones that they have, as well as their allies. Now, I think it's important to take a look from time to time at the actual size of the community or the estimated size. We're still incorporating data from the 2020 census, but there's another firm out in San Francisco called Community Marketing Insights that's not kind of connected to our firm. They have done a tremendous amount of work in terms of not only monitoring the size and the needs and the profile of the LGBTQ plus community, but they also are constantly updating that and sharing their information so that companies across the United States can make strategic choices. Now, their research, along with Gallup research, suggests that here in the United States, about 4.5% of the population would identify as being LGBTQ. Now, don't be put off by that small percentage, or don't be fooled by it, because that represents nearly 15 million Americans. And then when you add on top of that, those individuals that would consider themselves allies of the community, that represents a significant portion of our country. Here in Michigan, that's about 350,000, because I think Michigan identifies as about 4% of the population. So maybe about 350,000. And of course, The challenge with LGBTQ demographics, of course, is that researchers haven't even always asked the right questions. And so LGBTQ individuals haven't always felt safe in self-identifying. But nevertheless, regardless of the actual size or what percentage of Americans identify as LGBTQ, it's growing rapidly because younger Americans are no longer feeling like they have to hide. Gallup, even looking at the early 2020 census statistics, we're discovering that as many as 9% of millennials and 15% of Gen Z identify as LGBTQ. That's really groundmaking. I mean, that's the kind of statistics that I don't think any business can even afford to overlook. So, as much as I want to talk about the size of the community, I also think it's important to acknowledge that there are ways in which the community is alike, but there are also important ways that the community is different. We're going to talk for a minute about those. First of all, I think it's fair to say, first of all, that the LGBTQ plus market is generally understood as being very loyal and very lucrative. If you align yourself with the needs of that community and express ways to stand for that community, they are going to be incredibly loyal. And they express a lot of financial needs that you can certainly address. They look to companies to have LGBTQ plus friendly personnel policies. I think pretty universally, one of the first things they'll look at on your website is, how do you take care of your LGBTQ plus employees? It's also safe to say that one of the ways the community is alike is that they're relatively unified political bloc. And one of the things that I think is also pretty fascinating is they have very similar social media use. But the company that really looked at the data on the social media use also reminds everybody that looks at that data that the community is not some monolithic entity, right? Their research shows that while there are some similarities, like in social media use, there are also many differences that it's important to pay attention to. One of the things, though, that I guess before I talk about those differences, there is one more thing I want to point out. We should note that over the past 18 months, as the community has dealt with the impact of COVID-19, the LGBTQ community has identified that they have been impacted to a greater degree than most of the community in general. They more likely to work in jobs that are highly affected industries like restaurants, entertainment, and healthcare. And they're often the ones that have been more exposed or at a higher economic sensitivity to the crisis overall. They were also less likely to have health coverage. So it has been a very difficult year for many in the community. And as this data shows, there's still a lot of uncertainty about how the pandemic is going to impact individuals moving forward and how that's going to impact their financial situation. This survey was between 2019 and 2020, but 6%, I think it's important to highlight, 6% of participants downgraded their financial situation and 13% downgraded their economic expectations of this year. So once again, it's important to know as a whole, there are these kind of similarities, but let's talk about some of the differences. There is no single quote unquote gay market. Overall, the market doesn't look, act, or buy exactly the same way. And just as with non-LGBTQ plus communities, there's going to be differences in gender, in age, in ethnicity, in class, etc. The community's diversity is one of the reasons why you see the language used to talk about LGBTQ plus people is also constantly evolving. It used to be that gay was the umbrella term to discuss the entire community, but in a constant move towards inclusivity, the acronyms keep changing. And I realize sometimes that can be kind of a little confusing, but pretty universally now, LGBTQ or LGBTQ plus is being used to refer to that expanded version, because even the Q or the word queer has kind of been reclaimed by the community. It used to be very derogatory, but now it's been reincorporated. One of the other ways that the community is not alike is that increasing number of LGBTQ couples and households have children. That wasn't the case 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. And once again, it's important to understand that the community lives and works in all types of communities, not just urban centers, but urban, suburban, and rural. As you'll see in this particular slide, David Paisley at CMI always says, it's kind of a mistake to view the community as one cohesive unit, just because they don't all live in big cities. You've got a 65-year-old retired lesbian, moving to Traverse City, but you've got a 22-year-old single trans person living in Paw Paw. You've got same-sex couples like moving to the suburbs of Detroit. You've got to look at your segments based on age, location, relationship status, the same kind of segmentation you'd want to do with anyone you're reaching out to. Similarly, the community's diversity also means that they're going to have differing financial needs based on life stage. This was the response when asked, which of the following banking or financial services do you currently use or own? The types of financial services utilized are going to be very different, again, by generation. Checking accounts, of course, those numbers are pretty much the same. But when you get down this list, student loans, financial planning services, home improvements, or home equity loans, you can see that there are some differences generationally, as you might expect. And these kinds of things need to be factored into your outreach strategies. So, as I promised, I was going to share 4 things that I think are important to consider for strategies if you want to have outreach or connection with the LGBTQ plus community. So first, before you produce your first ad or your first rainbow flag is put up in a branch, you really have to get your internal house together. You really have to understand that the community tends to reject those brands that they feel are inauthentic or are just doing what's known as rainbow washing. Consumers are smart. All consumers are smart, and especially LGBTQ plus consumers, they can see beyond the brands who are doing something just to benefit their bottom line. They're looking at your company culture. So before you make that first outreach to the community, you have to ask yourself, why are you doing it? Is it to be of service? Is it gain market share? Outreach to the community invites a level of scrutiny to make sure that your messages are authentic. So you've got to evaluate your institution's readiness. Do you have top-down support from the CEO all the way down? Do you have employee buy-in? Is there going to be friction if you start outreaching to the community and not everybody on your team is involved? Right now, do you use inclusive language on your website or collateral materials? Are your policies, as I mentioned earlier, are they user-friendly and LGBTQ friendly? Are your products and services aligned specifically with those needs? And sometimes I think it's important to even stop and ask yourself the simple questions like, are your restrooms gender neutral? And how does this all line up with your bank's values? Do you say anything in your value statements about equality and inclusivity? Because equality is not just a single issue. It's a compromise of a lot of intersected causes. Youth suicide prevention, bullying, transgender rights, access to healthcare, HIV treatment. How you view all of those issues and how it aligns with your corporate and business goals has to be considered. Now, TD Bank, they're a great example. Long before they posted their very first ad or gave this ATM in Toronto the whole rainbow treatment, their CEO knew that they had to do and had to make their culture more inclusive. It was 25 years ago when they began offering same-sex benefits to their employees. But their CEO discovered initially only 55 of their 55,000 employees actually signed up. Their CEO was so frustrated. He was so confused. And then he discovered that within their culture, their employees were afraid to reveal their sexual identity to their colleagues. And so he began a personal initiative as CEO to change the culture of that bank. Now, it took him a lot of years to finally accomplish that, given the social construct of 25 years ago. But today, that bank is clearly recognized for their inclusive culture and their rather bold LGBTQ plus marketing. But they have shared that in their workplace, diversity, equity, inclusion is a way of life, and they're going to make sure that their consumers, all of their customers, can bring their whole self to the equation. Let's see, there we go. And TD and other large banks, they really continue to monitor and modify their own internal issues just to make sure they're in alignment with the external outreach that they do to the community. A few years ago, State Street Bank, which of course you may know is one of the oldest banks in the country, they decided to show their support through the words of their LGBTQ plus employees. So they actually interviewed those employees and helped use that story to express their support for the LGBTQ plus community at all. But the other point I want to make is that this whole process of internal evaluation often gets hung up on the institution's readiness to outreach any portion of the community other than the L and the G. They got the lesbian, they got the gay, okay. But when you expand that, sometimes it can create a roadblock internally. Recently I just read a story about a bank's call center employee who had frozen the account of a transgender woman because they sounded like a man. Even though they answered all the security questions right, they ended up being directed into a branch to show their ID in person. So it's not just about your policies, it's about your employee training. Are your employees prepared to seriously address the needs and concerns, not only of a lesbian couple buying their first home, maybe it's a transgender man saving money for reassessment surgery. All of this boils down to the degree of authenticity. All right, second, you've got to pick your targets, just like anything else. After you've done that internal work of evolution, you really need to research your markets. You really need to take a look at what targets are you going to pick within the community to outreach to, because any product or service can be positioned as being beneficial to the community, but it depends on who you really want to attract. You have to bring that same kind of segmentation expertise you deploy every day to the community and to the diversity that exists within that community. So if you're marketing a first-time mortgage to a lesbian woman, you're not going to use an image of two gay men, right? Although I've seen that mistake done before. One of the other things that I think it's important to keep in mind as you refine those targets and prepare your campaigns, you have to remember that language matters. As I suggested a little bit earlier, LGBTQ is now the most preferred term to describe the community. because I think it's about 54%. But that's changed quite a bit. This slide really offers up some of the most current thinking about terminology that's okay to use, terminology that's a little tricky to use, or I would put some cautions. As an example, using the word queer. That's something that's accepted by younger generations of the community, but not necessarily older. So if you're targeting LGBTQ millennials or Gen Z, you might be able to use that word in your marketing language, but not if you're targeting a LGBTQ boomer, as an example. It's interesting though, even with that word queer, right now, overall, less than 30% of the community have a negative reaction to that. So everything evolves, everything changes. And while terminology and using the right words is important, content and experience always matters the most. So I think it's important to say, you've got to keep your message on brand. You can't let your LGBTQ content overshadow your primary brand message. Because with every consumer, you have to remember to keep all of your outreach connected to real life and the brand personality that you're trying to create for your institution. Make sure there's alignment, because when there's disconnect, people can sense it. People can see through it. And that's what you want to try to avoid. And lofty messages of equality and equity are not as powerful as integrating real life examples of LGBTQ plus consumers. Sometimes it can be important just to connect to larger messages of inclusion. You've got to kind of avoid that stereotypical language. And it's important to speak with, not at. I think the LGBTQ community will always react negatively if they think there's a paternalistic message coming from a financial institution. This has to be seen, like with a lot of consumers, as a partnership, as you're there to support them. And of course, one of the suggestions I always make that, you know what, the rainbow flag in any of its iterations, and it's okay to use for pride, but if you overuse it in either your ads or your marketing, or even in your branch experience, it can begin to feel like pandering, especially if it's not anchored in real life support and outreach to the community. Third strategy, you've got to take a stand, but when you do, you have to prepare for haters. Now, just getting the acronyms right and, putting the rainbow icons in the right place and having the right messages, it's not always going to build that meaningful connection. You've got to be willing to take those kind of authentic stands and visible stands in support of the community. It's not just about marching in pride parades. Several national banks, like US Bank, pictured here, through their research, they found that customers want to do business with companies that really feel like they have an authentic interest in the community and its organizations. So they also discovered that affiliating with the bank's brand with inclusivity is a real way to support kind of inclusivity, customer retention, and employee morale. I think that when I look at what US Bank does, actually, I was in one of their new branches in one of the neighborhoods in Chicago recently. Noticed there's a picture of it in the lower left, because it's in the heart of the LGBTQ plus recognized community. They really outfitted their branch to outreach to that community. And they've been known for participating in like 30 different pride celebrations. They're the best place to work for LGBTQ plus equality for like 12 years. But what I want to point out is something that they did about 5 years ago. One of their strategy managers said, look, we want to create not only an LGBTQ plus banking site, so a dedicated site on their platform that was going to speak to the LGBTQ plus community. And if you ever want to look at it, just go to usbank.com/LGBT. It features articles and addresses topics from same-sex wedding planning to modern families. It really breaks a stereotypical mold. But this credit card that I have pictured here, or debit card, that's what really offers kind of an important actionable marketing tip. In an effort to inspire and uplift the community, they actually held a design contest. It's back about 4 years ago now, where they were encouraging consumers, didn't matter if you were LGBTQ or not, it was just, they opened it up to consumers all over to say, help us design the image for our new card. And by giving everyone an equal chance, they were saying, as a brand, they support representation of the LGBTQ plus community. And they were going to be inclusive in all of their marketing strategy. So taking a stand means offering LGBTQ plus specific financial education. That's what some of these LGBTQ plus focused institutions are actively doing right now. They're reaching out with the kind of content that is going to have a special resonance with the community. I think it's also important to be visible at events, not just Pride, but there are organizational activities that happen. There are LGBTQ plus community centers in practically every corner of the state, including even the Upper Peninsula. And I think it's important for banks to be visible at those kind of events and support LGBTQ plus organizations and causes. You know, make sure your charitable giving is aligned there. I think it's also helpful when you're not just advertising in LGBTQ plus publications. While that is certainly important, it's important to put your LGBTQ plus marketing in your mainstream media, in your television, in your digital advertising, all the rest, because ultimately, the more you can amplify those voices within the community, the more you're going to be seen as an ally. As an example, Eastern Bank, they really gave such a great example of amplifying the community's voice. You know, they're one of the largest and oldest mutual banks in the country, and they're very dedicated to social justice. It's kind of part of their corporate DNA. But a number of years ago now, they were one of the first companies to testify before the Massachusetts legislature in support of a transgender anti-discrimination bill. They really put their full support behind it and launched a digital campaign that featured this individual woman, even invited her to write a post on the bank's blog, which was pretty amazing. Now, the campaign's courageous messages really paid off, both online and offline. It had outperformed all of their other social media metrics. It gained them like over 12,000 positive reactions and had been shared all over the place. Their CEO even came out saying, look, trans rights are human rights, and protecting human rights are always good for business. Well, now, of course, when former President Trump signed the discriminatory directive banning transgender people from the military, they took a stand, as you see here, by putting up a billboard that read, "Good salutes all those who serve our country." And that means all. That's the kind of powerful statement that can make tremendous impact in terms of how the LGBTQ plus community sees your organization as an ally. Probably the fourth and final little strategy I'd offer up, or tactic, is you've got to be proud all year round. Because, as I say, connecting with the community means that you've got to do this kind of effort throughout the year, not just during Pride Month in June, not just excuse me, not just during October, during LGBTQ plus History Month. And it's not only about your charitable giving or your digital campaigns. Sometimes it's about your volunteer program. You know, where do you deploy your bank's volunteers? Because there are certain needs in the community. The example I want to offer up is Bank of Hawaii. Bank of Hawaii has a very good sized employee base, and more than 300 volunteers every year march in Honolulu Pride. That's a big deal. But beyond that, there's a Rainbow Film Festival, which outreaches to the LGBTQ plus community once a year. It's in between events. That's where they put their volunteers. They deploy their volunteers in a way that helps demonstrate their commitment to the community. And just before the pandemic hit, the Bank of Hawaii had asked 2 of their transgender employees pictured here if they wouldn't mind sharing their story of transition on their bank's blog. They shared the challenges and rewards they experienced during their journey, and they offered advice through their bank's blog and on social media for their peers and allies. They were given an opportunity to bring their whole selves to work. Initiatives like this are often driven by LGBTQ plus employees. Sometimes it's not about those that are agitating from the outside. It's about those that are nudging from the inside. You know, as banks take more visible stands on equal rights and positive LGBTQ plus representation, you know, firms like Bank of Hawaii and banks right here in Michigan really become part of the movement overall. Ultimately, advancements in equality for LGBTQ plus community have really come about as hearts have been changed and minds have been opened. In the months and years ahead, there's no more important way for the bank to stand for equality than by integrating the LGBTQ plus community into your overall marketing strategy and by telling powerful stories of inclusion. For this past year, BMO Harris Bank is running an ad called Pride Lives Here. And it features everyday pride moments from customers and employees. And to show off pride in its workplace, BMO Harris even launched a new Road to Allyship training program that gives their employees the resources they need to be supportive allies of their LGBTQ plus co-workers and their customers. These are the types of things that I take most excitement about. But I want to, before I begin to wrap up, I do want to share this one quick video because it's a great example of very powerful storytelling.
Make Me Happy is 100% gluten-free bakery. We specialize in nostalgic treats mostly.
The options for gluten-free people were very slim. And so our goal was how can we mainstream people with allergens? We have a whole segment of our customer base that they just come in because they want to support either a woman-owned business or LGBTQ or a Black-owned business. We are that business that kind of encompasses all these pieces that, you know, make up your neighbors. It is a bit of a niche bakery, but we learned during the pandemic that we are a really essential part of the industry.
From day one, we were ahead of any state mandates of what to do with your restaurant business. You shut down our seating almost immediately. We also have an online ordering system, so someone could order online and literally come in 15 minutes later to pick up. We put it on the table and they take it and go. We did not want to put anyone in any danger.
People needed guidance, and either you were going to step up and lead, you know, your staff or not. And we've never gone through anything like this before, but we can manage it. And these are the ways we manage it. And I think that's made a huge difference here. I think people see that we work hard and that we're invested in a brand that they can also be invested in.
Huntington Bank has a pretty significant footprint here in the state right now. And I think this is a perfect example of the kind of storytelling that engages your audience, evokes an emotional response, and speaks to your institutional values. You know, there's a very subtle message here about equality. It never used the word or term LGBTQ at all, but it still delivers a powerful message of support. Let's see if I can get to the next slide. There we go. A quick final thought before we open it up for questions. We covered 4 steps: evaluate and evolve, pick your targets, take a stand and prepare for haters, and be proud year round. John Williams, President and CEO of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, you know, look at this quote from him: creating an inclusive culture has no end date. Like so many aspects of culture and values, it's not a project with a deadline where you can say, okay, we're done now. At the Fed, they've taken steps to make their own workplace and policies and outreach more impactful, more inclusive, and more equitable. It reminds me always that even at the Fed, they're giving employees the option to add preferred gender pronouns to their official email signatures. So there's been a lot of movement in our industry. A lot has changed. And as I said at the beginning, you know, outreach, connecting with consumers has really transitioned so much. It's not just about promotion or persuading. At a fundamental level, it's about understanding your customer, really building and maintaining that relationship with them. Whether you're a bank marketer or a CEO or an HR person, any role that you play at the bank, I think it's important for you to remember that you function every day at the intersection of the needs of the bank and the needs of the customer. Thank you for taking time out of your day to think about how you can expand that to include the LGBTQ community.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Jim. Any questions?
Or comments?
Or comments, exactly. It's very good, thank you. Okay, well, thank you, Jim, that was very informational, very thoughtful. Appreciate you taking the time and sharing very important and impactful market share for our banks, for sure. If you have any questions for Jim that you think of, I will be sharing his contact information along with the recording, so you can reach out directly. But appreciate your time, Jim, and thanks everyone for attending, and have a great afternoon.
Excellent. Thank you all.